Hey everybody, welcome back to Anatomy 2. This is going to be the second part of our immune lecture, specifically that on the third line of defenses, the adaptive immune responses themselves. I'm going to try to shoot this in a little different way. I feel like just sitting behind the screen where you can't get any mannerisms or any real input isn't particularly conducive. So I'm going to try to shoot this thing from here. Okay, I'm going to give this a try. We're going to see what happens. No guarantees, but maybe it'll be better. Curious to see how it looks on video. All right, first thing to say, man alive. You want to know about some really terrible things in the past? Let me tell you a little bit about smallpox and the millions of people it killed over time. Let me tell you about polio and the lines of kids that had ended up with polio and ended up crippled in terrible ways. There have been many, many awful diseases over time which are now virtually gone, like smallpox and polio. These are non-existent for the most part in our world today because of the activities of our immune systems, and because of the activities of a couple of guys in particular. This is Edward Jenner in the late 1700s and Jonas Salk in the mid-1950s. These are the folks that kind of devised their accompanying vaccines, if you will, so for smallpox and for polio. And Jenner was kind of one of the first people that had ever kind of figured out the nature of vaccinations, and the story behind it is very fascinating. I advise you to go and look this up, but in an effort to save you as much time as possible, I'm not going to dive into the details. The long story short is, Jenner figured out that he could expose the human body to a variant of smallpox that was very weak and wouldn't cause an infection. Okay, you don't want this. These are terrible examples. You don't want that. So Jenner figured out that he could expose the body to a weakened form of smallpox, in essence, and then that person would no longer have any chance of getting smallpox as a result. Okay, so by being exposed to a weak version, you develop immunity. Okay, and the way that we do this is through this third line of defenses, our adaptive defenses. All right. Now this gets, well, hang on, let's stick to the script here. The important thing about the adaptive defenses is that they are very specific. So you'll have special B cells, for example, that will only work on polio, for example. All right. And they have memory. So once they have done the work with a certain disease, they will then be capable of defending us against it from that point forward. I realize how goofy this sounds by today's standard, but chickenpox. Do I have a chickenpox slide? Yeah. All right, hang on. Let me make sure we're together. All right, let me finish up this, and then we'll talk about chickenpox. So specific and immunity. Now, this adaptive defense system is broken down into two parts. These are humoral immunity. That would be in the fluids of the body using B cells. The nature of this, and I'm sure I'm jumping ahead here, but the nature of this is that this is acting against extracellular stages. Like if you got bacteria floating around in your bloodstream, your humoral immunity will take charge and deal with that using B cells in particular. And then by comparison, there is cellular immunity with your T cells. All right, so T cells come in a variety of different shapes and sizes, and for that matter, so do B cells. But the nature of T cells is that they can even determine variants in infected host cells. So if you have a virus and you have one of your own cells that matches your own major histocompatibility complex, again, that's that set of cellular markers that we talked about previously, your T cells can pick up even minor derivations in those host cells if they are infected, if they are malfunctioning, and can deal with them accordingly. So cellular immunity can deal with individual cells and problems within those cells. All right. This is going to be very reliant upon antibodies, which we'll be talking about soon, and you should have a decent grasp of already based off of our other conversations. I say that this process is a little slower. The nature of it is, with your third line defenses, with your adaptive defenses, you have to be exposed. All right, you have to be exposed to a pathogen before your immune system can develop memory. Your cells are what are referred to as being naive. You'll have naive B cells. You'll have naive T cells that have never come into contact with a real antigen before. or at least the antigens that we're trying to hunt down. And what we have to do is we have to expose ourselves to those antigens in real life, in reality, to then develop the immunity, the memory base for this system to function. So when you go and you get a vaccine, what we're doing is we're exposing ourselves to that potential pathogen, and the goal behind that is that our cells would no longer be naive. So the reason you go and you get a flu shot or something like that, you might develop a little bit of a fever, you might have a weird sensation, you might not feel particularly good, is your body's freaking out going, oh man, there's something bad coming in, but in reality it's not. So your immune system sort of goes back to normal quite quickly, but it's no longer naive. It has picked up those antigens and is like, I know what this is now. I know what to look for, and I'll be able to find it. I got to give you one analogy just to make a point here. I was doing freshwater cave crayfish research for a summer, all right? And I remember the first time I went in that cave, we're walking around looking for these crustaceans, and the guy I'm with is just picking them up all over the place. I mean, it's the cave itself is very dark. Like in terms of the bottom, you got lights on, obviously, but the bottom is like almost black. The rocks and everything there, and then these crayfish are completely white and they shine. So you'd think it'd be very easy to see them, but it's not. Okay, it takes you a little while to mentally develop what they call a search image, so that you can pick out what it is you're trying to find, and that's not unlike how your adaptive defenses work. It takes them a little bit to figure out what exactly it is they're supposed to be dealing with, but once they know, they are professionals. Okay, they can deal with them with great speed, to the point that you today, again, you've gotten an MMR vaccine, I predict, I hope. If you were exposed to measles or mumps or one of these really nasty ones that we've been vaccinated for, you could bathe in this stuff and have no effect. No effect whatsoever. You would have no illness. You'd have no signs of problems, no nothing. Even though you were heavily exposed to them, because your body has now developed memory for those problems because of your adaptive defenses, your specific immunity, and can deal with them before they even have the chance to hurt you. That's the nature of this, folks. Up here, if you are sick with a bacterial infection and your internal defenses, like your phagocytes or whatever, are trying to hunt down and destroy those bacteria, you're going to get sick regardless. Okay, you're going to be ill. Whereas down here, once you have developed memory, you will never even notice that you are infected. You will potentially get infected with something. Your body will attack it, destroy it, and get rid of it without you ever even remotely realizing that you are exposed. That's the glory of the adaptive defenses, that they are very active once they have developed memory. The trick is, again, they have to have that initial exposure. Whew, I probably have given you 90% of what you need already. All right, let's keep going. The nature of this is your adaptive defenses must come to contact with foreign antigens at least once prior to being able to protect the body. And you see how I say at least once. One of the things I want you thinking about here is getting booster shots. You've probably heard of getting a booster shot, or alternatively, I remember I had my lip cut open when I was working out in my shop, and it was a pretty nasty slice. And I went to the emergency room, got 3 stitches, good times. And they were like, hey, how long has it been since you've had a tetanus shot? And I was like, 10, 15 years. So they hit me with a tetanus shot just to make sure my adaptive defenses were prepared in the event there might be some potential bad bacteria hanging out in whatever it was that cut me. All right, good. So let's see. Your innate defenses can do damage to foreign substances on their first meeting. That's true, like your macrophages and natural killer cells. Whereas your adaptive immune system must be exposed first. But once you are exposed, then we have specificity. Okay, these are main characteristics. Specificity, that means you'll develop special B cells, special T cells that deal with only very specific nasty pathogens. Okay, and then you'll have memory. So if you're ever exposed to those same pathogens again, you'll be immune. Your body will react so quickly that you will not notice any illness whatsoever. Yeah, I think that'll work. And the way that we figured this out is kind of fascinating. This was using early animal serum immunity testing. what we would do, and oftentimes this is a happy accident, is there would be a person whom is working with animals and they're exposing them to some sort of disease to monitor effects on that disease or means of treatment or anything along those lines. And a famous example of this was Charles Chamberlain and Louis Pasteur working with chickens and cholera. They're giving all these chickens cholera. And one stage, they had some that lived, okay? And the chickens that lived through it were then completely immune to cholera from then on out. They do the same thing with dogs, and I forget exactly what pathogen it was they were treating them with. But they did the tests. Some of the animals lived, and then they tried to just recycle them into the experiment again, and then they showed no response whatsoever to the pathogen. They're like, oh wow, they're completely immune. But then the glory of this was that they extracted blood from those animals, spun it down, and in essence what they were doing is they were removing the buffy coat. Okay, and in any white blood cells that were there, and also in the plasma, they're removing the entirety of all antibodies found within the system. So they could then inject that into a sick dog, and the sick dog would get better quicker because their serum contained antibodies, for example, that could help defend the sick animal against the pathogen. It's a genius move of being able to distinguish how exactly this all works. And it's a little more complicated than that, but, that's life. Now let's talk a little bit about chickenpox. Man, let me tell you, you guys, young folks there, I've probably got a shot to help you not get chickenpox. That is not the way it worked for me. Back in my day, in the mid to late 80s, they would have what are called chickenpox parties. Some person's kid would come down with chickenpox, and the nature of chickenpox is you get it while you're young, it's not so bad, and then you become immune to it. So somebody's kid will get chickenpox, and then they bring in a bunch of kids from the neighborhood all to play with the chickenpox kid, and then everybody's got chickenpox. They all get over it, and now you're immune to it. And it keeps you from having some potential major issues as an adult. I remember distinctly my brother getting chickenpox and not being told to stay away from him. So I ended up coming down with chickenpox as well. And I still have some scars here and there from these big whelps that come up on the body. I got some good ones on my back, man. And that's something that you no longer have to deal with because we get a shot these days, a vaccine, if you will. And that vaccine prevents you from having to experience chickenpox, which is fantastic. And it's the same for a whole host of things, like HPV comes to mind. You can get a vaccine for HPV these days, which in the past, and I mean recent past, last 15 years, folks could get some of the nastier variants of HPV and end up with, for instance, cervical cancer. So by having a shot for that now, that is dramatically superior option. All right, cellular identification. So we need to talk a little bit about antigens. So you know that, for instance, your red blood cells can display antigens. These are going to be markers on their external surface that, in essence, say what kind of red blood cell you have. We have wholly undersold this as a concept. There are lots of antigens out there on many different types of cells. There are many different types, but generally speaking, all cells have exterior markers. And those exterior markers can give us the ability to recognize. This is very important. These are terms you need to know. They give us the ability to recognize what's called self and non-self. Self, non-self recognition. Okay, so the antigens on the surface play a role in this. And your book makes a differentiation between antigens, which your book says are foreign agents that will mobilize your immune system, and then what are called self-antigens, which it refers to as MHC proteins. This would be your personal cellular markers. The way I've always heard this phrase is that antigens are markers on the outsides of cells, and they are capable of stimulating immune responses. That's absolutely true. But for instance, your red blood cells might have type A antigens. That's what they are. Okay, you have antigens there. And then you personally, as an individual, have an incredibly complex set of cellular markers called the major histocompatibility complex protein network. Major histocompatibility complex. And this is like a cellular barcode. This is a group of 50 or more individual protein markers, sugar markers, that will allow your cells to distinguish yours versus somebody else's. We're going to talk about organ transplants here in a little while. When dealing with organ transplants, you may have heard someone at some stage say that, oh, they had a match and they used the organ from that match. A good example of this is a terrible example, but it's good all the same. A young lady that I knew in my youth got struck by lightning and it killed her, man. Just turned the lights out, just killed her dead. But they were able to get her heart and flew that thing to Texas, where somebody was waiting for a heart transplant because they were a match for one another. When somebody says they're a match, what that means is they're talking about their very complicated major histocompatibility complex proteins. All right, so we have lots of these, and some of us are more genetically similar than others, and none of us are perfect identical matches, but we're close enough that it's workable. All right, so that's what they're talking about when they say somebody's a match. So again, last but not least, this is our capacity for identifying self versus non-self. This is incredibly important. Your white blood cells have to be able to identify foreign antigens and then attack and destroy them. And equally as important, they have to be able to identify your own MHCs and know not to hurt you. Or else you end up with what we call an autoimmune disease. And that is nothing you want, I assure you. All right, antibodies. And again, we've already kind of played this game. You should have a good grasp already. But antibodies are indeed immunoglobulins, particularly the gamma globulins found in your blood proteins. These are going to flow through your bloodstream and attach to foreign antigens, and they work like big neon signs, okay? So the idea is when that antibody binds to a foreign cell, it's like saying, this is foreign and it needs to die, all right? I have found an E. coli bacterium in the bloodstream. Come and attack and destroy it. And things like your natural killer cells or your cytotoxic T cells, which we'll get to in a little while, big macrophages. So they'll come in and they'll just tear into anything marked with an antibody. Okay, so the nature of antibodies is they mark cells for death. Antibodies do not directly destroy anything. What they do is they help lead to the destruction of foreign cells. And your book goes into a little more detail than this, so they give you a few different means of attack. Neutralization, so they say antibodies can work by neutralization. The nature of this is that the antibodies can block up the active sites on bacteria, viruses, what have you. And what's important about this is, like a virus, for example, when it gets to a cell, it has to attach to that cell's exterior markers and convince the cell to let it in. Whereas if there are antibodies there, the antibodies will bind up the viral markers so that the virus can't connect to the cell. It'd be like if I came to your house and I put JB Weld, which is a hardening putty, into the lock. Okay, there'd be no way to get a key in, so you're not getting in that house. That's what happens with antibodies. Agglutination, so antibodies can often have 2 or more binding sites. I mean, you got some antibodies that can bind up to 50 different molecules, and what will happen is, if they come into contact with lots of these molecules, they'll just all bind in together and form a huge mass. Agglutination, binding up, and then a big white blood cell like a macrophage can come in and deal with whatever's there. Precipitation, so sometimes you'll have potentially dangerous dissolved compounds in the bloodstream, and antibodies have the ability to find and bind these. To find and bind, sounds good, and bring them out of suspension so that your white blood cells can then deal with them. And then last but not least, the complement system. Man, let me tell you, the complement plays a major role in all of this. So complement has the ability, once antibodies have bound to a cell, they can be activating complement, and then complement will lead to, as we talked previously, poking holes, in essence, into a foreign cell, leading to its lysis. Okay, so the complement system will activate that, will complement that general immune response based off of antibodies binding to a foreign cell. And then the complement itself increases the inflammatory response, which speeds up antibody production and distribution. Yeah. All right, the cells of adaptive immunity come in a few different flavors. There are T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. That's absolutely true. Now, you got to remember that these are just lymphocytes, so they all arise from the bone marrow. But the reason we call them B and T lymphocytes is because B lymphocytes then mature in the bone marrow before leaving to go out to like a lymph node or something like that. Whereas the T lymphocytes go into the bloodstream, they flow up to the thymus gland, and then they hang out in the thymus gland for a period of time prior to being released and heading off to a lymph node. So they will mature in the thymus gland. T lymphocytes, boy, they're really dangerous. Okay, if you think back to when we did lymphatic system, the thymus gland has like a blood barrier system internally to make sure that nasty T lymphocytes don't get out. All right. So while these are maturing, what they have to do is they have to develop what's called immunocompetence. That's the ability to recognize surface antigens or to pick up any foreign materials, or in essence determining self as well, in a cell, and then they have to develop self-tolerance. So they have to have the ability to recognize your own major histocompatibility complex and then not respond to it. So they have to pick up your antigens and not kill your cells, and they have to be able to pick up foreign antigens. And that's what's happening. So once they have matured in the bone marrow, in the thymus, they've developed these capacities, they then leave and go out typically into a lymph node. And it's in the lymph nodes where they get exposed to real antigens and get their first what's called challenge. They are naive coming out of the thymus, out of the bone marrow. They get into the lymph node, and then they are challenged, and then it's game on. All right? Game on. Yeah. Yeah, that'll do. Let's go here. A part and parcel with this whole conversation are antigen-presenting cells. Okay, antigen-presenting cells are very important for adaptive immunity. Man, there's a whole host of these dendritic cells, of which Langerhans cells are a part. Yeah, sorry, I saw that. I wrote monocyte-derived down here, but that's obviously true. Big old macrophages, reticular cells, a whole host of things can act as antigen-presenting cells. Let me explain to you what might happen here. Actually, I think I have a graphic of it. So let's say you've got a big macrophage or something along those lines, for example. Or let's even say a Langerhans cell. So this is one of the realm of dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are incredibly good at picking up foreign cells. So you're going to have these Langerhans cells hanging out right underneath the skin surface. And what will happen is if any bacteria can make their way in, the Langerhans cell will pick that up, and then it will lead to this cycle. So what will happen is the Langerhans cell will engulf via endocytosis. It will phagocytize that foreign particle, destroy it using internal digestive enzymes from typically a lysosome, and then void any cellular products that it doesn't need. But the antigens, the specific antigens from that bacterium, will then be brought to the surface and held there so that they can be presented to B cells, presented to T cells. They can be presented to parts of your adaptive immunity. And it's in essence like saying, hey, this is what we're looking for. Like when I was in that cave doing the research with the completely white, blind cave crustaceans, the guy's like, he catches one, he's like, hey, this is what it looks like. You know, they look like this, and when it's in the water, it looks like that. It's helping your adaptive immune cells see the foreign antigen. Okay, so it's very important to have these antigen-presenting cells. It's really quite fascinating from my perspective. So imagine, if you think back to our inflammation slide a while back, you had that big swollen toe. Okay, so there will be macrophages there cleaning up, attacking any foreign cells, typically bacteria and infection like that. And once they have done so, they will, as macrophages, have the antigens of those foreign bacterium. They will get into the lymphatic system, flow to a lymph node, present those antigens to your adaptive immune cells. Your adaptive immune cells will then become activated, in essence. They are no longer naive. They know what to look for. And then they pass up into the cardiovascular network and go back to the toe to hunt more of those bacteria. Now they have been exposed. They have been activated. They are ready to do battle, and then they get into the bloodstream and go down there to do it. So the lymphatic system comes first. They leave the lymphatic system, go into cardiovascular, and then go down there to hunt. It's really a wild thing. It's almost like, well, let's not go into a whole lot more detail. I think that'll do. Yeah, I think that'll do. Major histocompatibility, very important. So there are two branches of the adaptive immune system, if you haven't been able to figure that already. These are humoral immunity. This is antibody mediated. These are using primarily B cells. And yeah, antibodies. The antibodies are the main idea here. Humoral immunity doesn't directly destroy anything. What it does is it releases massive quantities of antibodies, and then these antibodies mark cells for death. Those marked cells can then be dealt with by other parts of the immune system, like macrophages or even certain T cells. All right, so very important. This system is great for broadcasting antibody all throughout the body, so that any foreign cells can be marked for death. Importantly, this only works against extracellular stages of infective microorganisms. Again, you have to be a free-living organism for an antibody to bind to you. So if you're a viral particle and you've gotten into one of my own human cells, then antibodies are cruising around in extracellular space. They can't bind, so humoral immunity can't do anything to them. If it's a bacterium that's managed to get into one of your cells, then antibodies can't get at that bacterium to mark it. So it's out of luck. This only works on extracellular stages. T-cell-based immunity, however, all right, cellular immunity, cell-mediated immunity, it can directly attack and destroy diseased host cells. Now, it can attack free-living cells as well, but diseased host cells is very important. The idea here is that your let's not go into a lot of detail just yet. Your T cells have the ability to feel of your cells and pick up if there's anything weird going on. Okay, so if you've got a virus inside that cell and it's using your host machinery, your T cells can detect that there's something weird going on inside of there and lead to that cell's destruction. If you have a cell that's had a malfunction to its genetic code and it's gone cancerous, your T cells can detect that there's something weird going on with that tissue, and it will cause apoptosis that will lead to its destruction. It's when this system breaks down that we have issues with cancer. All right, we have malfunctioning cells all the time, and your T cells detect and destroy them. All right, so this is very important for us. Very important. Now, how the heck does it work? There are a few different ways of explaining this. I'm going to take my best stab at it. What we have are lymphocytes that are B lymphocytes. They arise in the bone marrow, they mature in the bone marrow, and then they leave and they go out to a lymph node. Now, when they are hanging out in the lymph node, they can be exposed to an antigen. Like maybe a helper T cell will come around and activate them. They've been exposed to an antigen. The helper T cell comes in and tells them to begin work. You'll see why that is in just a second. And then once this has gone on, once this B lymphocyte bound to an antigen becomes activated using a helper T, they differentiate into two different cell lineages. This is called clonal selection, if I'm not mistaken. But regardless, they differentiate and they begin to reproduce. They become very, very mitotic. And what they do is they become a massive quantity of plasma cells and a small number of memory cells. So you got a B lymphocyte. It binds to an antigen. It's activated and told to start doing work by a helper T cell that guarantees that this is what needs to be happening. And then they become many, many, many plasma cells and a few memory cells. Now, what do the plasma cells do? They crank out antibodies at an incredible rate. 2,000 a second. Huge numbers of antibodies. But the thing is, these plasma cells, and again, think about this, they're making lots of antibody. That antibody is flowing through the bloodstream, and any antigens that those antibodies are capable of binding to are going to get bound up. You release just ridiculous quantities of these antibodies. So they're going to be flowing through your bloodstream, and any foreign cells that are there that match, they're going to bind to them and mark them for death. Now, these plasma cells don't live very long, just a few days in most cases, whereas then the small number of memory cells that are hanging out, they live for years and years and years and years. And the nature of this is as follows. If I get exposed to the same pathogen a second time, like 8 months from now, my memory cells are going to pick up that antigen and then immediately turn into plasma cells and start cranking out antibodies. Here, I had to have a naive lymphocyte It's going to have to bind to that antigen. It's got to be activated by a T cell. It's going to start dividing into plasma cells, and then those plasma cells start releasing antibodies. This takes time. Once I've developed specificity and memory, I've got my memory cells. When I'm exposed a second time, those memory cells become plasma cells immediately and start blazing out antibody like it's going out of style. All right? So the nature of this is that the first time you get sick, you're going to get sick. But the second time you're infected, you don't even notice because you crank out antibodies and destroy those foreign antigens, if you will, or cells that bear those antigens immediately. Very quick indeed. Yeah, absolutely. And again, let me make the point. Your memory cells can live a long time. Decades. Absolutely decades. And this cartoon sort of lines all this out, and I think it does so in a beautiful way. So what we have are B cells. They will pick up a foreign antigen, and that B cell has to be activated by a helper T cell. And once it's activated, it will differentiate into plasma cells and memory cells. Lots of plasma cells, a few memory cells. Those plasma cells crank out antibodies that mark foreign cells for death, and then you'll have big macrophages that'll come around and tear into those. And I think the plasma cells might also release is it interleukins? They call for help, in essence. All right, they call for help, and then big macrophages that are phagocytic will come and attack any marked cells for death. And then again, we've got our memory cells hang around, so if this ever comes into contact one more time, they just go straight to here instead of having to do all this. Okay, so you developed memory, you developed immunity to whatever pathogen that is. And now let's talk about cellular immunity. So cell-mediated immunity or cellular immunity is dealing with T cells. These T cells are indeed lymphocytes, and they will go out and directly attack diseased host cells or directly attack foreign cells, generally speaking. This is the only way we have of dealing with cells that are malfunctioning, like cancerous cells, or dealing with cells that are infected with a virus. It's the only way we can really deal with them, okay, using this cellular side of immunity. So we have T cells. They will arise in your bone marrow. They're going to go to your thymus, where they're going to differentiate and mature, and then they're going to make their way into your lymph nodes. Now, there are 3 types of T cells that we're going to talk about. There's actually 4, but for us, we're going to talk about 3 of them. These are cytotoxic T cells. The cytotoxic T cells are the hunters. Okay, these are the ones that are going to go out and do work. They're going to go and tear into any foreign cells they find. They do this by feeling of their major histocompatibility complex. They can identify cells that are not yours. They can identify cells that are malfunctioning, i.e. cancer. They can identify cells that maybe are virally infected. These cytotoxic Ts are extraordinarily good at self-non-self recognition. And the way that they work is not unlike a natural killer cell. They use perforins. So they will go and they'll poke holes all in a cell that needs to be destroyed. And again, you can see the holes here in these cells. And by poking holes in them, they will lyse. They'll be destroyed. They'll go through apoptosis. So cytotoxic Ts are not phagocytic. They're going to lead to destruction in other ways. Basically, they kill the cell, and then phagocytes like macrophages clean up the mess. Then there are helper T cells. Helper T cells sort of run your immune system. It's a dumb way to say it, but it's true. They sort of lead. Hang tight. Yes?
Hey, Daddy.
Hey, buddy. Hey, I'm recording. Come here. You want to say hi? Come here. Oh. All right, wave the camera. The camera's right there. Say hi.
Hi.
All right, this is why we record at night, isn't it? All right. Oh, go play.
I miss the Daddy.
Sorry, these things happen. All right, where the heck am I at? Helper Ts. So helper Ts sort of maintain general immune function, okay? They certainly do direct macrophages. They call for help when necessary. They certainly do activate B cells of humoral immunity. So if you remember up here, when the B cell binds to an antigen, it has to be activated by a helper T. Oh, hang on, wrong direction. And they certainly do activate other T cells. So helper Ts sort of guide the whole immune response. And then, of course, there are memory Ts. And memory T cells will stick around after cytotoxic Ts have been called in to do work. Your memory cells will have the ability to recognize foreign antigens and lead to an immediate response, not unlike the memory cells here. The only difference is these memory cells will become plasma cells that crank out antibodies, whereas down here, these memory cells will become cytotoxic Ts and directly attack foreign cells. Good. All right, and here's a nice breakdown of sort of how this works. So, how does cellular immunity work? Here we have to have appropriate antigen-presenting cells. So T cells don't do well by their lonesome. They have to have antigen-presenting cells to say, hey, this is what we're trying to find. Go and hunt down cells that are malfunctioning or cells that display these antigens. So your antigen-presenting cells, imagine, again, like a macrophage or a dendritic cell. It's been cruising around. It's found a foreign cell. It's engulfed it. It's taken the antigens from that foreign cell. It goes into a lymph node. It finds a helper T or a cytotoxic T. It says, hey, look for this. This is the bad thing. Okay, I'm showing it to you. Here it is. This is what we got to deal with. Go find it and deal with it. So then that's cytotoxic T typically, or a helper T, will begin to go through what's called clonal selection, clonal division. It will differentiate into piles of cytotoxic Ts, some helper Ts that'll kind of guide the immune response, and then memory Ts that can be in the background for the next time. But these cytotoxic Ts will find those enemy cells which display the appropriate antigens and destroy them using perforins. Then, mixed into this, our helper Ts are going to call for help. They're going to call using interleukins, okay, to attract in other cells to do work for us. And again, last but not least, we're going to have these memory T cells that are going to sit around and sort of begin this process much quicker as opposed to having to be up here and dealing. So, take-home messages. Both cellular and humoral immunity require 3 basic steps. Recognition, they have to pick up foreign antigens. Then they will attack and destroy those foreign antigens, and then they'll develop memory that can sit around and be ready the next time. Again, this is the classic example. My dog wants that now. This is a classic example. This is why I work at night. The classic example is, again, you're exposed to a foreign antigen. You make these plasma cells that crank out antibodies. They're going to call in help, and your body will destroy it. Yeah. Okay, let's just move on because I am distracted. Okay, good. Something different. Immunizations. So what the heck happens when you get a vaccine? What's the whole point of this in most cases? Well, the idea is you're going to get a shot, and when you get that shot, you are exposing your immune system to that foreign pathogen, exposing it to the antigens in a lot of cases of that foreign pathogen. And upon that first exposure, you will develop plasma cells that are going to start cranking out antibodies, and you'll see a rise in what's called your antibody titer. That's the amount of antibody in your blood plasma. Now, first exposure, not a whole lot's going to happen when you're getting a shot like this. But what we'll often do is we'll go back and we'll get a booster shot. And upon that booster, new antibodies being presented, the body will really respond and crank out antibody like it's going out of style. The nature of this is the more exposure, the more titer, the more antibody we have in the bloodstream, the more protected we are. Again, that's why every 10 years or so, I really forget how long it is, somebody's going to have to look that up, but you have to get a new tetanus shot, especially if you're doing work where you might be exposed to Clostridium tetani. So we get these to boost our titer, to boost the memory cells, because those memory cells just don't live forever. They have, 10, 15, 20-year lifespan. Yeah, I think that'll do. So what is all of this stuff? Well, a vaccine is any substance that might contain foreign antigens, and a vaccination is an artificial exposure to those antigens. So what in the world are we getting at here? Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to acquire immunity. So how do we acquire immunity? Well, it can come in 2 flavors, that done naturally and that done artificially. When it comes to naturally acquired active immunity, okay, hang on. Dog, leave me be. And now my dog is officially in the room. All right. Where the heck am I at? So we're acquiring immunity. We can do this naturally or artificially. In terms of naturally acquired immunity, that's coming into contact with the pathogen. So in other words, this is, and now the dog wants out. Go on. Bangs at the door, and then he wants out immediately. He's like, "You're not going to pick me up?" Anyway, this would be like me and my chickenpox, okay? I was exposed to chickenpox, and I developed immunity to it. That's the idea here. That is naturally acquired active immunity. Active and natural. This is done in a normal way. Passively acquired natural immunity, this is like a kid being born with mom's immune system. So antibodies are capable of crossing the placenta, and when antibodies cross the placenta, that kid's going to be born with those antibodies in his or her bloodstream. And then further than that, if mom breastfeeds, then breast milk actually contains large amounts of antibodies. So for the duration of breastfeeding, the kid's basically protected by mom's immune system, which is why you see kids that are breastfed having fewer problems than alternative because of these increased antibody loads from the milk. And then, of course, there are artificially acquired there are artificial means of acquiring immunity. There we go. Active immunity, this is going to be like through a vaccine or what have you, any attenuated pathogens that might come in. So you go and you get a vaccine. This is going to expose you to something potentially dangerous, and then you'll be protected from it. In both of these cases, you're going to develop memory, and it's going to stick with you for a prolonged period of time. That's the goal of active immunity, is we develop memory from it. Okay, passive immunity, we do not develop memory. So that kid is eventually going to have to make his or her own antibodies. Okay, and that's going to be as a result of naturally acquired active immunity or artificially acquired active immunity. The kid's going to have to make his or her own antibodies at some stage. It's just we can protect that kid for a period of time for the duration of breastfeeding. And then on the opposing side of this is getting a shot of somebody else's antibodies. If you guys remember back to hemolytic disease of newborns, where there's a kid, and that kid is rhesus positive, and mom's rhesus negative, it's possible if mom has rhesus positive antibodies, those antibodies could cross the placenta, get into the kid, and lead to agglutination of the kid's growing red blood cells. Well, what we do is, to prevent this, is we give mom that RhoGAM shot after her first pregnancy to go in and destroy. We're giving her a shot of antibodies that destroy rhesus positive blood. That shot with antibodies will mark those cells for death that might have gotten into her bloodstream, so that mom's immune system doesn't even have to respond. And if that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, go back and look at that conversation on hemolytic disease. So the nature of this is, with the first child, when the first child is born, if the kid's rhesus positive and mom's rhesus negative, mom is going to build antibodies against rhesus positive blood. So future kids might have major problems. That's hemolytic disease of newborns. So by giving mom a RhoGAM shot, which is basically just antibodies against rhesus positive blood, we can prevent mom's immune system from responding. We can give her passive, artificially acquired immunity so that her actual immune system doesn't ever respond. Yeah, that works pretty good. We even did this back several years ago for Ebola. So when we had a guy that came back to the U.S., had Ebola. I believe he was a doctor over there for a period of time. And boy, his immune system just tore right into Ebola. Like, he was fine. They treated him at Emory, and that's in Georgia. And he was fine, man. He took it like a champ. So they extracted serum from this guy and spun it down and used it to inject into other folks that were coming back with Ebola so that they could heal faster. What they were doing is they were giving folks passive, artificially acquired immunity. So this other person had established it, and they're extracting from him to pipe it into other people to help them heal more quickly. And I'd be willing to bet that we now have, in essence, a vaccine for Ebola just for emergency situations based off of that guy's immune system. Pretty neat stuff. All right, how can the immune system harm the body? Well, it can do so in a whole variety of ways. Allergies are one of these. Tissue rejection from transplantation, and then general immune system disorders. And again, we can do a whole week on these conversations, man, but I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. So, allergies. An allergy is a weird sensitivity to something harmless. Pollen cannot hurt you. You could bathe in it. You could put it in your cereal in the morning. You could put it in your coffee. It don't matter. Pollen can't hurt you. It's not something that can cause you damage. But some folks respond to pollen and have a crazy allergic reaction. They swell up. Their eyes get red. It's not an ideal situation. That would be for them an allergen. An allergen, that would be it would present antigens that cause a reaction. For no reason, a meaningless reaction. Man, let me tell you, my wife gets around somebody that's got a cat, and that cat causes my wife to have all sorts of problems. Weird runny nose, itchy eyes, like you just wouldn't believe it, okay? You wouldn't believe it. So this falls into the realm of an allergic reaction. Again, my brother, all right, my brother has had crazy reactions to bee stings over the years, and I've been stung by bees lots of times, and it's never really caused me a problem. The idea is that an allergy is when the body responds strongly to something meaningless. Meaningless. All right, an immediate allergic reaction. Let's see, where do we want to go here? The nature of this is that we are going to cause some of our white blood cells to crank out a bunch of histamine. And what histamine does is it causes general inflammation and swelling of our tissues. So what happens with the wife and the cat? Dilated blood vessels. That makes them more leaky. What do leaky blood vessels lead to? Well, that leads to overproduction of mucus and a runny nose. Your skin gets itchy because of all the dilation taking place there. You're producing excess tears, so your eyes get watery. Sometimes this can cause your bronchioles to swell a little bit. You can have asthma, general cramping, a whole host of negative effects from something meaningless. That cat, the dander, if you will, from that cat can't hurt my wife, okay? Can't hurt her. But when she's around somebody's cat, she has these effects. It's an allergen. It's an allergen. It's the immune system responding strongly to something that is nonsensical. And then this can be vastly worse, like anaphylaxis, for example, or anaphylactic shock, which I believe we've talked about in a previous lecture. My brother, again, bee sting, having an allergen directly inserted into the bloodstream can lead to very, very dangerous things very, very quickly. All right. So constricting bronchioles, you can't breathe. Tongue swelling up, can't breathe. General vasodilation, which means fluid loss and circulatory shock. Really dangerous. You can die quite quickly from anaphylaxis. So how do we treat it? We give you an EpiPen typically. You get somebody a hit with adrenaline, and adrenaline leads to broad spectrum vasoconstriction. So it fights off the effects of histamine. Histamine causes vasodilation. The epinephrine causes vasoconstriction, and the person comes back to normal pretty quick because the lymphatic system will return that fluid back to flow. Yeah, I think that'll do. And then, of course, there are delayed allergic responses. That's true. So, for instance, poison ivy is the famous example here. You're out playing around the woods. A few days later, you see a weird rash pop up. That's because you are hitting your immune system with foreign antigens, and your memory T cells will wake up and see this and attack it. And it will happen a few days later. It's not an immediate thing. And TB skin test is the same kind of concept. Probably a better example for you guys. When you get a TB skin test, what they're trying to do is they'll give you a little shot right in the hypodermis of the skin, and then you got to come back in a few days and have it read. They got to look at it. What they're doing is they're trying to see if you've ever been exposed to tuberculosis. If you've been exposed, we're going to go further from there. But if you've never been exposed, nothing's going to happen to these antigens. Yeah, that'll work. Transplantation. So in the realm of transplants, there are a few different formats that typically are used. And I wish I had a bunch of time on my hands. I'd tell you all about this movie. If I were you, just go watch it, man. Pause this. You got time on your hands, you're a college student, go watch The Island, all right? I think you'll be entertained. It's a neat principle. I'd love to hear about it, all right? It's a neat, go watch the film. In the realm of transplantation, hint, hint, not giving anything away here, but all the same, there are autografts. Autografts are coming from you. They're going to have your matching histocompatibility complex. So imagine you get a burn, and then they cut some skin off of you and put it over the area where the burn is. That is your own skin. There's no chance of having problems. You're not going to have any rejective issues because it matches your major histocompatibility complex. What's my example here? So imagine having open heart surgery and they do some bypasses. Well, they do those bypasses using veins from your own body. So yeah, there's no chance of rejection here. Then there are isografts, which don't really even merit conversation, but are worthy, I guess, being that well, let me not give anything away. An isograft is coming from someone genetically identical to you. So if you have an identical twin and you have rhabdomyolysis and both your kidneys are destroyed, you could have your twin pop a kidney out for you. Twin's going to be fine because one kidney's all you need, really. And put that kidney in you, and you got no chance of tissue rejection because you guys are identical. And I mean identical twins, that is. So an isograft is coming from someone genetically identical to you. Then there are allografts. This is coming from other folks, other humanoids. The nature of an allograft is that you want to get as close to the same major histocompatibility complex as is physically possible to limit the chance of rejection. But the reality is rejection is very common. Okay, very common. Our immune system is real good at identifying self and non-self. So that's why that girl's heart got flown to Texas, because somebody there was very close to her major histocompatibility complex, and that increased the chance of it taking and working out. And then, of course, there are xenografts, where we take parts from other wholly different animals and use them for our purposes. Now, for decades, we've been doing pig valves. Okay, a pig valve is very normal. When a heart valve gets, let's say, stretched out, or for whatever reason isn't as taut as it needs to be, doesn't move the way it's supposed to move, we can pop those valves out and throw some pig valves in the heart, and you never know the difference. Works like a charm. Very little chance of rejection because of the nature of the cells that are there. Yeah, it works great. Absolutely great. But probably more fun are other forms of xenografts, like this one here. I believe this was China, but don't quote me on that. What they did is they had a burn victim, and instead of transplanting that person's own skin, or instead of doing what we do in the U.S. typically, which is a cellulose wrap, they used sterilized fish skin, and put that over the area of the wound. So what happened is, over time, the person's own skin grew in underneath the fish skin, and eventually the fish skin flakes away, and the person is protected and allowed to heal back. And that worked pretty well. So there are, of course, possibilities of xenografts. Yeah. And, man, it goes way deeper than this. We are trying to build specialized pigs, for example, that have no cellular markers on their surfaces, no antigens, no MHC, no nothing. And if we can do that, then we'll, like somebody needs a heart transplant, we can just yank a heart out of one of these special pigs and drop it into a person, and you'd never know the difference. Xenografts, okay, pretty neat concept. For many years, we've been trying to clone blood, for example, like type O blood. Imagine we could genetically engineer some pigs that make type O blood, and we could just drain them and use it for our own purposes. That would really help things out. Anyway, that's good enough. Let's go here. Tissue rejection. So yeah, your cytotoxic T cells are just really good at recognizing that your cells are your cells and other cells aren't your cells. So if you get a heart transplant, the chance that your immune system is going to pick up that transplant is not yours and destroy that organ is incredibly high. Okay, incredibly high. In fact, about half the people that have an organ transplant after about 10 years end up with major issues as a result of rejection. And the way that we try to quell this is by administering people like pretty intensive immunosuppressant drugs. Steroids that slow down inflammation, anti-proliferatives that stop cells from dividing rapidly, i.e. clonal selection, with your white blood cells like T cells, recognizing antigen and dividing, and then general immunosuppressants. Now you can imagine this is a real problem. What if you get a cold? What if you get the flu? What if you catch COVID? and your immune system's been depressed by medication, man, you're going to have problems. All right. So this is a dangerous concept, but something we have to do. It's better to be very weary of infection than dead. So if you got to have a heart, you got to have a heart and deal with it. We got to do this. Yeah. But here I'd say that times they are changing. We're working on ways of dealing with this as we speak. One of the neat things that I've heard about recently is if they do a heart transplant, it's possible that we could withdraw a little bit of bone marrow from the person whom is the donor of said heart transplant, for example, and then dust your bone marrow with this other bone marrow and help you develop what's called a chimeric immune system, where you can tolerate 2 sets of MHCs. But boy, I'm here to tell you, I haven't looked into that in a while, and it's probably a little ways down the road before that's a possibility. And then last but not least, I think, last but not least, there are autoimmune diseases, and again, I'm just not going to go into a lot of detail on this, because I know this takes a lot of time. But there are autoimmune diseases out there where your own white blood cells attack and destroy your own body tissues when they're not supposed to. Classic examples of this are multiple sclerosis, lupus, myasthenia gravis. Rheumatoid arthritis is a big deal. Like, this is where your white blood cells will attack and destroy your joint cavities and lead to major cartilage damage. Another really important example of this is type 1 diabetes. So in type 1 diabetes, your white blood cells will go in and destroy your islets of Langerhans and lead you to an incapacity to make insulin. So autoimmune diseases are a real problem, man. They're very scary stuff. Dealing with when your, for instance, cytotoxic Ts can't distinguish self and non-self, so they attack everything. Okay, dangerous. And then, of course, there are immunodeficiency diseases. These are examples where the body can't defend itself against foreign pathogens. Severe combined immunodeficiency is a really important one here. So there's a movie called Bubble Boy, which yet again, you should go and watch that movie and you'll know exactly what we're dealing with here. This is where the person's white blood cells don't have the ability to recognize foreign antigens, if I'm not mistaken. So they don't have immune function at all in any fashion. You get a cold and you die. It's terrible. There is some theory that we could probably do a bone marrow transplant, and then that new bone marrow will begin producing appropriate functioning white blood cells, but I haven't looked into it in a little while, so I'm not sure exactly where they are on that. And then there's diseases like AIDS, for example, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So what AIDS does is it makes your helper T cells no longer active. So if your helper Ts don't work, that means you can't make antibodies. And if you can't make antibodies, you can't defend yourself against foreign pathogens. A person doesn't die from AIDS. They die from a cold. You don't die from AIDS. You die from some simple infection that your body can't fight off because you don't have functioning helper T cells. Ergo, you can't make antibodies. All right? It's terrible, man. It's a terrible thing. But that's a nice conversation on active immunity. Okay, so let's call it there, and I'll get this thing put up, and then I'll begin working on your next lecture. You got a test coming before you know it. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good day.